Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into something absolutely insane. What if Luffy had infinite Haki? Now listen, we all know Luffy's Haki is already pretty broken, right? The dude can knock out entire armies with his Conqueror's Haki, predict attacks with his Observation Haki, and his armament can clash with the strongest fighters in the world. But imagine if those powers had no limits whatsoever. We're talking about Haki that extends across entire islands, observation that can read the emotions and intentions of everyone simultaneously, and conquerors that can literally rewrite people's wills. This isn't just strong, this is reality-warping, god-tier power that makes even the Yonko look like children. So we thought, what if we took this concept and explored the psychological horror of becoming too powerful? What happens when unlimited compassion meets unlimited ability to act on it? This story follows Luffy as his infinite Haki awakening at Marineford transforms him from the cheerful pirate we love into something cosmic and terrifying, a being who can solve every problem in the world but risks losing his humanity in the process. It's a journey through transcendence, sacrifice, and the ultimate question: is it better to be human and limited or godlike and alone? If this concept sounds as epic as I think it does, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell because we're about to blow your mind. Alright, let's dive into this masterpiece. The air above Marineford crackled with tension so thick it seemed to press down on the very souls of those gathered. Monkey D. Luffy stood frozen, his fists trembling as he watched his brother Portgas D. Ace kneel on the execution platform, sea-stone shackles gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The war had raged for what felt like eternity, but time seemed suspended in this singular, horrifying moment. "Any last words, Fire Fist?" Sengoku's voice boomed across the battlefield, his golden Buddha form towering over the condemned pirate. Ace lifted his head, and despite everything, the pain, the despair, the certainty of death, he smiled. That same crooked grin that had reassured Luffy through countless childhood adventures. "Yeah," Ace said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I only regret that I won't be able to see Luffy become the Pirate King." Something inside Luffy's chest cracked. Not his ribs from Garp's punches, not his spirit from the endless battles, something deeper, something fundamental. "Stop!" The scream tore from his throat with such raw anguish that Marines 300 meters away staggered. But it was too late. The executioner's blade was already falling, catching the light like a falling star. In that moment, that crystalline instant between life and death, Luffy's Conqueror's Haki exploded outward. It started as it always had, a wave of overwhelming willpower that sent fodder Marines toppling like dominoes. But something was different this time. The wave didn't stop. It didn't fade at the edges or dissipate into the air. Instead, it kept growing, expanding, intensifying with each heartbeat until the very atmosphere seemed to vibrate with Luffy's rage. Marines by the thousands collapsed, but so did pirates. Even veteran fighters like vice admirals found themselves struggling to remain conscious as the Haki washed over them in increasingly powerful waves. The sea itself began to churn, waves rising without wind as if the ocean were responding to Luffy's call. What is this?" Sengoku's transformation flickered, his golden form wavering under the assault of pure willpower. Whitebeard, even in his wounded state, felt his eyes widen in recognition and horror. "No. This can't be happening again." The executioner's blade, inches from Ace's neck, simply stopped. Not because the man chose to halt, he was unconscious like most others on the platform. The blade stopped because the very air around Ace had become thick as honey, reality itself bending under the weight of Luffy's desperate will. And then Luffy screamed again. This time, the sound carried something more than anguish. It carried the voice of every dream deferred, every promise broken, every injustice witnessed. The rubber boy's devil fruit, already strained by his desperate fighting, suddenly snapped, not broke, but snapped like a rubber band stretched too far, bouncing back into something entirely new. The awakening hit him like a freight train made of pure possibility. Luffy's body began to change, but not in any way the textbooks described. His hair turned white, yes, but his eyes. His eyes began to glow with an inner light that seemed to contain the reflection of every star in the sky. The ground beneath his feet started bouncing, then the air around him, then the very light itself began to bend and stretch like rubber. But it was the Haki that truly broke everything. The Conqueror's Haki that had been expanding outward suddenly rebounded, crashing back into Luffy's awakening devil fruit like two tsunamis meeting head-on. The collision created something that had never existed before, a feedback loop of infinite willpower regenerating itself through the awakened fruit's reality-warping properties. Luffy felt his consciousness expand. First beyond his body, then beyond the battlefield, then beyond the island itself. He could suddenly sense every living thing within a radius that kept growing, 10 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles. Fish in the depths of the ocean, birds in the clouds above, every marine and pirate still conscious on the battlefield. Their emotions, their thoughts, their very souls pressed against his awareness like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. "Brother!" Ace's voice cut through the chaos and Luffy's head snapped toward the execution platform. His enhanced senses could see everything now, the molecular structure of the seastone shackles, the exact trajectory needed to reach Ace, the precise amount of force required to shatter every restraint. Luffy moved. He didn't run or stretch or bounce. He simply was on the platform, having crossed the distance in a way that defied physics and logic alike. The Marines guarding Ace crumpled before they could even register his presence, their minds overwhelmed by the sheer density of Haki radiating from his form. "Ace," Luffy whispered, and his voice carried harmonics that made the air itself weep. He touched the seastone shackles and they didn't break, they simply ceased to exist, unmade by a will so powerful it could impose impossibility upon reality. Ace tumbled forward, free but barely conscious. "Luffy, what's happening to you?" That's when Luffy tried to answer and realized he couldn't remember. The voices in his head were too loud now, not just the voices of people, but the voice of the wind, the voice of the sea, the voice of Marineford itself. The island was in pain, he realized with startling clarity. All the violence and death had wounded it deeply, and it was crying out for someone to hear its anguish. "I can fix this," he thought, and the thought terrified him because it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I can fix everything." "Straw Hat," Akainu's voice boomed from below, but it sounded distant and small. Luffy looked down and saw the Admiral charging upward, magma fist extended, and he could see it all, every possible trajectory, every outcome, every choice that had led to this moment, and every choice that would follow. He could stop Akainu without even moving. Just a thought, a brief application of Conqueror's Haki, and the Admiral would crumple like paper. He could end this entire war the same way, simply by willing it to stop. The realization should have been liberating, but instead, it filled him with a cold dread that felt entirely alien to his nature. Instead, Luffy grabbed Ace and leaped backward off the platform, his awakened body bouncing off the air itself to carry them both to safety. But as they landed among the Whitebeard pirates, Luffy felt his knees buckle. "Luffy!" Marco was beside him instantly, phoenix flames flickering as he tried to assess the rubber boy's condition. "What the hell was that, your Haki?" "It's still expanding, Yoi," and it was. Even now, even with the immediate crisis past, Luffy could feel his Conqueror's Haki radiating outward in slow pulses, each one carrying his will farther across the Grand Line. Somewhere in the distance, he could sense Sea Kings beginning to migrate toward Marineford, drawn by something they didn't understand but couldn't resist. "I can hear them," Luffy mumbled, his voice unnaturally quiet. "All of them. The fish, the birds, the island, it's all so loud." Ace, still weak but determined, grabbed his little brother's shoulders. "Luffy, look at me, you saved me, okay? We're going to get out of here and everything's going to be..." "No." Luffy's interruption was soft but carried such finality that everyone within earshot fell silent. "Nothing's going to be fine. I can see what comes next. All of it." He looked up at Ace with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "You're going to try to fight Akainu to protect me. You're going to get hurt, but you don't need to anymore because I can." He trailed off, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I can make him stop. I can make all of them stop. I can make everyone stop." Whitebeard, leaning heavily on his Bicento, studied Luffy with the gaze of someone who had seen too much history repeat itself. "Marco," he said quietly, "get them both to the ship." "Now?" "But Pops, the war is over," Whitebeard declared, and there was a terrible sadness in his voice. "Look around you." Marco did, and his eyes widened. Across the entire battlefield, Marines and pirates alike were slowly backing away from Luffy's position. Not in defeat or retreat, but in instinctive fear. Even hardened veterans who had never retreated from anything were taking unconscious steps backward, their hindbrain recognizing a predator so far above them on the food chain that fighting was not just futile, it was inconceivable. More disturbing still, some of them were weeping without knowing why. "Straw Hat," Sengoku's voice carried across the battlefield, but even the fleet admiral sounded shaken. "What have you done?" Luffy looked up at him, and for a moment his expression was perfectly calm. Too calm. "I won," he said simply. "I saved Ace. Isn't that what I was supposed to do?" But even as he said it, Luffy could feel something slipping away inside him. The constant input from his expanded senses was like trying to drink from a fire hose, overwhelming and impossible to process properly. Worse, each pulse of his conqueror's haki seemed to carry a little bit more of himself outward into the world, spreading him thinner and thinner across an ever-expanding network of consciousness. He could sense a butterfly landing on a flower 3 islands away. He could feel the emotional state of a whale in the depths of the ocean. And with each new sensation, Monkey D. Luffy became a little less himself and a little more something else entirely. "Ace," he whispered as his brother helped him stand, I think I'm scared." It was the last purely human thing he would say for a very long time. As the Whitebeard pirates began their retreat, carrying both Fire Fist Ace and the boy who had saved him, strange reports began flooding in from across the Grand Line. Weather patterns were shifting without cause. Sea kings were abandoning their traditional territories, and in a dozen different kingdoms, sensitive individuals, fortune tellers, priests, anyone with even a fragment of observation haki, suddenly collapsed, overwhelmed by a presence so vast and alien that their minds simply couldn't process it. Above Marineford, the sky began to change color, aurora-like patterns dancing through the clouds despite the blazing sun. The island itself groaned like a living thing, its bedrock shifting in response to vibrations that had nothing to do with earthquakes and everything to do with the awakening of something that should never have been awakened. In his office at Marine Headquarters, Fleet Admiral Sengoku stared at the readings pouring in from monitoring stations across the world. Haki levels were spiking globally, and all of them seemed to be resonating with a single source point, the unconscious boy currently being carried away on Whitebeard's ship. "Sir," a trembling communications officer reported, "we're getting calls from every Marine base in the Grand Line. They're all reporting the same thing: spontaneous haki manifestations, animal behavioral anomalies, and..." "Sir, some of them are saying their observation haki users are picking up someone else's emotions. Someone who's everywhere." Sengoku closed his eyes and tried not to think about the classified reports he'd read, the ones locked away in the deepest vaults of Mariewa. Reports about individuals throughout history who had transcended the normal limits of haki, becoming something more and less than human in the process. They had called them living gods, and every single one had eventually become a threat that required the combined might of the world government to contain. "Put me through to the 5 elders," Sengoku ordered. "Priority 1, and activate Protocol Titan." As the communication was established, Sengoku looked out at the retreating Whitebeard fleet and wondered if they had just witnessed the birth of the most dangerous individual in the world's history, or its eventual savior. Either way, Monkey D. Luffy would never be the same again, and neither would the world. The gentle rocking of the Moby Dick should have been comforting, but Monkey D. Luffy couldn't feel comfort anymore. Everything was too loud, too bright, too much. Even with his eyes closed, he could perceive the ship around him in perfect detail, every grain of wood, every thread in the sails, every heartbeat of the crew members moving above deck. 3 days had passed since Marineford, and Luffy hadn't truly slept once. "His vital signs are stable," Marco reported to Whitebeard, though his voice carried an undercurrent of concern that Luffy could taste like copper on his tongue. "But his haki, Pops, it's not stopping. If anything, it's getting stronger." Luffy lay in the ship's medical bay, but his consciousness stretched far beyond the confines of his physical form. He could sense fish swimming 100 miles away, feel the emotions of sailors on distant ships, hear the whispered conversations of people on islands he'd never visited. The Grand Line had become his nervous system, and every sensation was being fed directly into his overwhelmed mind. "Luffy," Ace's voice cut through the cacophony, and for a moment, everything else faded. His brother sat beside the bed, lines of worry etched deep into his face. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm everywhere and nowhere at the same time," Luffy answered honestly, his voice unnaturally quiet. The words carried harmonics that made the ship's timbers creak in response. "I can hear them, Ace, all of them." "Hear who?" Luffy's eyes opened, but they weren't quite the same eyes Ace remembered. They held depths that seemed to stretch infinitely inward, reflecting lights that didn't exist in the physical world. "Everyone. The fish think about currents and food and staying alive. The birds dream about wind patterns I can't understand. There's a whale somewhere singing about loneliness that's lasted 300 years. He sat up slowly, and Ace noticed that his brother's movements had changed. Where Luffy had always been energetic and chaotic, now every gesture carried an eerie precision, as if he could see exactly how each muscle would respond before he moved it. "And the people," Luffy continued, his gaze distant. "I can feel what they're feeling. A woman on Sabyati is crying because she lost her son to slavers. A boy in the East Blue just caught his first fish and he's so proud. A Marine somewhere is writing a letter to his mother, but he doesn't know he's going to die tomorrow." Ace felt a chill run down his spine. "Luffy, you're scaring me." For the first time since awakening, Luffy's expression showed something resembling his old self, a flicker of concern, of the caring little brother Ace had always known. "I'm scaring me too," he admitted. "I don't know how to make it stop." Marco landed on the windowsill in his phoenix form, then transformed back to his human shape. His medical examination had been ongoing for days, but he'd never encountered anything like Luffy's condition. "Your haki isn't depleting Yoi," he reported. "Normally, even the strongest users eventually exhaust their reserves, but yours. It's like you've tapped into an infinite well." "That's not possible," Ace protested, but even as he said it, he could feel the truth of it. Luffy's presence was overwhelming in a way that defied explanation. Being near him was like standing next to the ocean. You couldn't ignore the vast, incomprehensible depth of it. "I used to get hungry," Luffy said suddenly, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Remember, Ace? I was always hungry, but now I can sense every piece of food on the ship, know exactly how it tastes, how it feels, what it will do to my body. There's no surprise left in it." The simple statement hit Ace like a physical blow. Luffy without his appetite was like the sun without warmth, fundamentally wrong in ways that couldn't be articulated. "Maybe that's temporary," Ace offered weakly. "Maybe once you learn to control this new power." "I don't think it is temporary," Luffy interrupted, and his voice carried such certainty that it felt like a pronouncement of fate. "I can see things, Ace, not just with my eyes, but deeper, I can see the shape of what's coming." He looked up at his brother with those infinite eyes. "You're going to ask me what I mean. Then you're going to get frustrated when I can't explain it properly. Marco is going to suggest we find someone who understands Haki better. And then," Luffy paused, his expression growing distant again. "Then you're going to realize I'm not the same person anymore, and you're going to be sad about it. I can see it happening before you even know you're going to feel it." The accuracy of the prediction was terrifying, not because it was supernatural, but because it was delivered with such casual detachment. The Luffy that Ace knew would never speak about his brother's future sadness with such clinical dispassion. "Straw Hat," Whitebeard's voice boomed from the doorway, and even the legendary Yonko seemed subdued in Luffy's presence. "We need to talk." Luffy turned toward him, and Whitebeard felt the full weight of that transformed gaze. It wasn't hostile or challenging, it was simply aware in a way that made the old pirate feel exposed, as if every secret he'd ever kept was laid bare. "You know what's happening to me," Luffy said. It wasn't a question. Whitebeard nodded slowly. "I've heard stories, legends from before my time, pirates who transcended normal human limitations, who became something more. They called them living gods, and what happened to them? They stopped being human," Whitebeard answered bluntly. "Every one of them eventually lost themselves to the power. Some tried to rule the world, others tried to destroy it. A few just disappeared, becoming part of the sea itself." Luffy absorbed this information with that same unsettling calm. "I can feel it happening," he said. "Every time my haki expands, every new voice I hear, I become a little less me and a little more something else." He stood up, and the simple movement sent ripples through the ambient haki around them. "I saved you, Ace, that's what I wanted to do." But the cost, for the first time since his awakening, real emotion crept into Luffy's voice. Not the explosive passion he'd always been known for, but something deeper and more profound, a sadness that seemed to encompass the weight of the entire world. "I don't think I can be your little brother anymore." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ace reached out to grab Luffy's shoulder but hesitated at the last moment. Even that simple contact felt dangerous now, as if touching his brother might pull him into that infinite awareness. "That's not true," Ace said, his voice thick with desperation. "You're still you, Luffy." "You're still am I?" Luffy asked, and the question carried such genuine uncertainty that it broke Ace's heart. "When I look at you, I can see your entire genetic history written in your haki. I know exactly how you'll react to everything I say before I say it. I can feel your love for me, but I can also feel your fear, your grief for the person I used to be." He walked to the window, his movements still carrying that unsettling precision. Outside, the ocean stretched to the horizon, but Luffy's senses extended far beyond what his eyes could see. "There's a storm coming from the northwest," he said conversationally. "Not a weather storm, a marine fleet. 12 ships led by someone with very strong haki. They're 3 days away, but they're following our wake." Marco and Whitebeard exchanged glances. They'd received no reports of pursuit, but somehow they didn't doubt Luffy's assessment. "How can you possibly know that?" Marco asked. "I can sense their intention," Luffy replied, still staring out at the seemingly empty sea. "Their determination has a flavor to it, salty and bitter like old grudges. They want to capture me alive." He turned back to face them, and his expression was almost apologetic. "I think they want to study what I've become, turn it into a weapon maybe. Or figure out how to replicate it. Then we'll fight them," Ace declared, flames beginning to flicker around his fists. "We'll protect you like you protected me." Luffy looked at his brother for a long moment, and Ace could swear he saw galaxies spinning in those transformed eyes. "I could sink their entire fleet without moving from this room," Luffy said quietly. "I could reach out with my haki and simply stop their hearts, all of them. Or I could rewrite their wills, make them turn around and go home, make them forget they ever wanted to capture me." The casual way he discussed such overwhelming power was somehow more frightening than any threat could have been. "But if I do that," Luffy continued, "if I start using this power to solve problems, when does it stop? When do I stop being someone who protects his friends and start being someone who controls them?" The question hung heavy in the air. Nobody had an answer because nobody had ever faced a situation like this before. "What do you want to do?" Whitebeard asked finally. Luffy was quiet for so long that they began to wonder if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was very small, almost like the child he'd once been. "I want to remember what it felt like to be surprised by something," he said. "I want to not know what's going to happen next. I want to be hungry again and excited about adventures and worried about my friends because I can't see every possible outcome." He looked directly at Ace, and for just a moment, his brother saw a glimpse of the old Luffy buried beneath all that infinite awareness. "I want to be human." Outside, seabirds began changing their flight patterns, drawn by something they couldn't understand. In the depths below, sea kings stirred uneasily, responding to a call that bypassed their conscious minds and spoke directly to something older and deeper. Across the Grand Line, sensitive individuals paused in their daily routines, touched by a sense of profound longing that wasn't their own. In Marine headquarters, newly installed monitoring equipment registered haki fluctuations unlike anything in their databases. And in the medical bay of the Moby Dick, a boy who had gained the power of gods wept for the humanity he was losing, while his brother held him and pretended not to notice that his tears fell upward, defying gravity like everything else about what Luffy had become. The transformation was accelerating, and they all knew it. Soon, the choice between power and humanity would be made for him, but not yet. For now, Monkey D. Luffy was still present enough to mourn what he was losing, still human enough to be afraid of what he was becoming. And that perhaps was the most terrifying thing of all. The Marine fleet appeared on the horizon exactly when Luffy had predicted, their white sails cutting through the morning mist like knives. Admiral Kizaru stood at the bow of the lead ship, his usual lazy demeanor replaced by something approaching genuine concern. Behind him, scientists in white coats calibrated strange devices that hummed with an energy that made the air itself feel heavy. "Target confirmed," reported Captain Sentamaru, lowering his telescope. "The haki readings are off the charts, Admiral. Whatever happened to Straw Hat at Marineford, it's still getting stronger." Kizaru adjusted his yellow-tinted glasses, studying the distant pirate ship with newfound interest. "Scary a boy who can project Conqueror's haki across 3 islands simultaneously. The 5 elders are very interested in understanding how such a thing is possible." On the Moby Dick, the Whitebeard pirates prepared for battle with grim determination. But the strangest thing was their newest member's reaction, or rather, his complete lack of one. Luffy sat cross-legged on the deck, his eyes closed and face serene. His white hair flowed in a breeze that touched no one else, and around him, the very air seemed to shimmer with potential energy. He looked more like a meditation statue than a pirate captain preparing for war. "Luffy," Ace called out, checking his weapons. "The Marines are almost here. We need to—" "I know," Luffy interrupted softly. "Admiral Kizaru, 12 ships, 347 soldiers total. They have new weapons designed specifically for me. Seastone nets that can extend using pneumatic systems, Haki dampening fields generated by some kind of machinery I don't recognize. He opened his eyes, and they reflected the approaching fleet despite facing the wrong direction. They're scared of me, all of them, even the Admiral. Their fear tastes like copper pennies and old regrets. Marco landed beside him, having just returned from a scouting flight. Their formations are weird yoi. Almost like they're trying to surround something much larger than our ship. They are, Luffy said matter-of-factly. They're not trying to surround the Moby Dick. They're trying to surround my Haki field. They think if they can compress it, they can weaken me. He stood with that same eerie grace, and several pirates unconsciously stepped back. Not out of fear of Luffy himself, but out of instinctive recognition that they were in the presence of something that operated by different rules than the rest of reality. Will it work? Whitebeard asked bluntly. Luffy tilted his head, considering the question with the same detached curiosity he might use to examine an interesting cloud formation. Maybe. I'm not sure what happens if my Haki gets compressed. I might become more focused, more myself again. Or, he trailed off, but everyone present could feel the unspoken alternative hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Or you might explode, Ace finished grimly. Or I might explode, Luffy agreed with unsettling calm. The first cannonball whistled overhead, and that's when everything changed. Luffy didn't move to dodge or deflect the attack. He simply looked up at the incoming projectile with mild interest, and it stopped midair. Not because he'd caught it or blocked it, but because his observation Haki was reading its trajectory so perfectly that he was unconsciously projecting that knowledge outward, creating a field of absolute predictability around himself. The cannonball hung suspended for a moment, then began to move backward along its original path, accelerating until it struck the marine ship that had fired it with devastating accuracy. Did he just reverse time? Vista whispered, his swords forgotten in his hands. No, Marco breathed, his medical training allowing him to understand what they'd witnessed. He predicted exactly where it came from and used his Haki to send it back along the same path. But to do that, he'd need to calculate wind resistance, gravitational effects, the exact force of the original firing. Child's play, Luffy said, and his voice carried harmonics that made reality itself seem more flexible. When you can perceive every variable simultaneously, physics becomes more like suggestions. More cannonballs filled the air, and Luffy dealt with each one the same way, not through violence or spectacular displays of power, but through absolute understanding. Each projectile was neutralized by being perfectly understood, its energy redirected with surgical precision. But it was when Admiral Kizaru himself attacked that things became truly unsettling. The Admiral moved at light speed, appearing directly behind Luffy with a kick that should have been impossible to dodge. But Luffy was already turning, his hand coming up to catch Kizaru's leg with casual ease. You're very fast, Luffy observed, holding the Admiral's limb like he was examining an interesting specimen. But speed requires intent, and I can read your intent before you form it. You wanted to kick me in the head. Now you want to transform into light and escape. In 3 seconds, you're going to realize that won't work either. True to his prediction, Kizaru attempted to dissolve into photons, but found himself unable to do so. Luffy's Haki had somehow created a field of absolute presence around them, making it impossible for the Admiral to become anything other than corporeal. Scary, Kizaru said, but his usual drawl carried genuine unease. What exactly are you now, Straw Hat? Luffy released him and stepped back, considering the question with that same thoughtful detachment. I'm not sure. I can feel myself changing every day. Sometimes I think in languages I don't remember learning. Sometimes I dream about islands that sank before I was born. He looked around at the battle raging between the fleets, and his expression grew infinitely sad. I could end this fight right now. I could reach into every Marine's mind and show them the futility of violence. I could make them understand peace so completely that they'd never want to hurt anyone again. The offer hung in the air like a divine promise, and several Whitebeard pirates found themselves hoping he would do exactly that. But if I do, Luffy continued, I won't be protecting you, I'll be controlling them, and once I start controlling people. He trailed off, staring at his hands as if they were stained with blood only he could see. When does it stop? Ace finished, understanding finally dawning on him. When does it stop? Luffy agreed. Instead of ending the battle through overwhelming force, Luffy did something that shocked everyone present. He began to cry. Not the explosive, emotional tears of the old Luffy, but quiet, dignified weeping that seemed to carry the weight of cosmic sadness. And as his tears fell upward toward the sky, defying gravity, something extraordinary happened. Every person in the battle, marine and pirate alike, felt it. A profound sense of loss that wasn't their own, a grief so pure and overwhelming that it cut through hatred and duty and fear like a blade through silk. Weapons lowered unconsciously. Angry shouts died in throats. Even Admiral Kizaru found himself blinking back unexpected moisture. What is this feeling?" Sentomaru whispered, his massive frame shocking with emotion he couldn't understand. "Loneliness," Luffy answered, though he was too far away for anyone to hear him clearly. "It's the loneliness of being the only one who can see everything and can't unsee it. The loneliness of loving people who are becoming more like equations than friends." His tears continued to fall upward, and where they touched the sky, the clouds began to part, revealing stars that shouldn't have been visible in daylight. Whitebeard, ancient and experienced, recognized what was happening with a mixture of awe and terror. He's not just feeling his own emotions anymore, the old Yonko realized. He's feeling everyone's. Every person in this battle, every fish in the sea, every bird in the sky, that's not Conqueror's Haki, that's something else entirely. The battle didn't end in victory or defeat, it simply stopped. Both fleets found themselves unable to continue fighting in the face of such overwhelming sorrow. Marines returned to their ships without orders. Pirates lowered their weapons without discussion. Even the sea itself seemed to calm, as if the ocean couldn't bear to add its turbulence to the grief already filling the air. Admiral Kizaru stood on his deck, staring across the water at the boy who had just ended a naval battle by weeping. His orders were clear: capture or kill the Haki anomaly known as Monkey D. Luffy. But looking at the figure surrounded by impossible tears falling toward heaven, he found himself wondering if they were trying to contain a person or a force of nature. "Admiral," one of his scientists called out, "the readings they're impossible. His Haki signature is registering across the entire Grand Line. Every monitoring station from here to the Red Line is picking up his emotional state." Kizaru nodded slowly, making a decision that would probably cost him his rank. "All ships, stand down, we're returning to headquarters." "Sir, you can't capture sadness, Doctor," Kizaru said quietly, "and that's what he's becoming, not a person who feels sad, but sadness itself given form." As the Marine fleet began its retreat, Luffy finally stopped crying. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture so human and familiar that it made Ace's heart ache, and turned to face his friends. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I didn't mean to share that with everyone. I'm still learning how to keep my feelings to myself." "Luffy," Ace said carefully, "how long have you been feeling like that?" Luffy considered the question with that same thoughtful detachment. "Since I woke up, I think, maybe before. It's hard to tell where my emotions end and everyone else's begin now." He looked around at the assembled pirates, his gaze touching each of them in turn. "You're all so worried about me. I can feel it like a weight on my chest. You want your friend back, but he's becoming something else, and you don't know how to mourn someone who's still standing in front of you." The accuracy of the observation was devastating in its casual delivery. "We're not mourning anyone," Marco said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. "You're still here, Yoi, you're still Luffy." For the first time since his awakening, Luffy smiled. It wasn't the broad, infectious grin he'd once been known for, but something smaller and infinitely sadder. "I hope so," he said, "but I'm not sure I'll know the difference if I stop being me and start being something else. That's what scares me the most, not that I might change, but that I might not notice when it happens." As the Moby Dick sailed on through seas that seemed calmer than they had any right to be, none of them noticed the subtle changes already taking place. Fish swam in more organized patterns in their wake. Birds adjusted their migration routes to follow the ship from a distance. Even the weather seemed reluctant to disturb their passage. The boy with infinite Haki was beginning to unconsciously impose order on the chaos around him, and with each small change, he became a little less human and a little more something else entirely. But for now, he was still present enough to be afraid of what he was becoming, and that, perhaps, was the last thing keeping him anchored to his humanity. The descent to Fishman Island should have been magical. 10,000 meters beneath the surface, the underwater kingdom sparkled like a jewel in the abyss, its coral towers and bubble-wrapped districts defying the crushing depths through ancient technology and natural wonder. For any normal pirate crew, the sight would have inspired awe and excitement. Luffy felt nothing. He stood at the bow of the Moby Dick as they approached the island's entrance, his white hair flowing in currents that touched no one else. Where once he would have been pressed against the railing, shouting about the amazing underwater kingdom, now he simply observed with that same unsettling calm that had become his default state. "It's beautiful," Ace said, trying to recapture some of the wonder they'd shared as children. "Look at all those lights, Luffy, and the fish are huge." "I can see them," Luffy replied quietly. "All of them." The buildings are made from a coral that grows in specific harmonic frequencies. The bubble coating technology works by manipulating surface tension through controlled electrolysis. There are 47 different species of fish visible from here, and most of them are afraid. He paused, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "They're afraid of me, even the sea kings in the deepest trenches. They know something has changed in the ocean's balance." Marco, who had been monitoring Luffy's condition constantly, felt his medical instincts screaming warnings. "The pressure down here should be affecting your Haki range, Yoi. Water dampens most forms of energy projection." "Should be," Luffy agreed, "but it's not. If anything, being surrounded by so much water is amplifying it. I can sense the sea floor, the thermal vents, the ancient ruins buried in the deep places." And his eyes widened slightly, the first real expression he'd shown in days. "There are voices down there, old ones, older than anything I've heard before." As if summoned by his words, massive shapes began moving in the darkness beyond the island's lights. Sea kings, creatures so ancient and enormous that they were practically living islands themselves, emerged from the abyssal depths with movements that sent tremors through the water. But they weren't attacking. They were gathering. "What the hell?" Vista breathed, watching as titans that could swallow their ship without noticing surrounded Fishman Island in a loose circle. "Why are they just floating there?" "They're waiting," Luffy said, and his voice carried harmonics that made the water itself resonate. "They've been waiting for someone like me for 800 years. The revelation hit the crew like a physical blow. 800 years, the same length of time as the Void Century, the missing period in history that the world government had worked so hard to erase. "Straw Hat," Whitebeard said carefully, "what exactly are they waiting for?" Luffy closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they reflected depths that seemed to contain the memories of oceans. "They want to show me something. The real history, the truth about what happened during the Void Century and why the world government fears people like me." Without warning, he dove overboard. "Luffy!" Ace shouted, but his brother was already gone, his body cutting through the water with inhuman grace. The awakened mythical Zoan had granted him more than just rubber properties. He moved through the sea like he belonged there, like the water itself was welcoming him home. The largest sea king, a creature so massive that its eye alone was larger than their ship, turned toward Luffy as he descended. When their gazes met, something profound passed between them, not communication in any conventional sense, but a sharing of awareness that transcended language. "Young King," the Sea King's voice resonated directly in Luffy's mind, carrying with it the weight of centuries. "You have awakened the old power, the power that once nearly destroyed the world." "I didn't mean to," Luffy replied, his thoughts carrying clearly through the water to the ancient being. "I just wanted to save my brother. Intent matters little to power of this magnitude. You are becoming what we once served, a living god, a being whose will shapes reality itself. The last one nearly unmade existence before he was stopped." Images flooded Luffy's consciousness, not his own memories, but those of the Sea Kings who had witnessed the Void Century. He saw a figure wreathed in impossible light, standing atop a kingdom that floated in the sky. He saw the 20 kings who would later become the world nobles, united not by greed but by desperate necessity as they fought against a being whose power had grown beyond all control. "Joy Boy," Luffy whispered, recognizing the figure somehow. That was Joy Boy. "Joy Boy was the first to achieve what you have achieved," the Sea King confirmed. Infinite Haki, reality-shaping will, consciousness expanded beyond mortal limitations. "He began as you did, a protector, a liberator. But power without limits inevitably corrupts even the purest hearts." More images flashed through Luffy's mind. He saw Joy Boy's gradual transformation from liberator to tyrant, watched as the man's desire to fix the world led him to impose his will on everything and everyone. He saw civilizations reshaped according to one man's vision of perfection, saw the desperate alliance of the 20 kingdoms as they realized that their former ally had become something monstrous. "Is that what I'm becoming?" Luffy asked, and for the first time since his awakening, his mental voice carried real fear. "You are following the same path," the Sea King replied with ancient sadness. "Already you impose order on chaos without realizing it. The weather calms in your presence. Animals alter their behavior to please you. Even your friends' emotions are beginning to align with your own." Luffy looked up toward the surface, using his expanded senses to observe his crew on the Moby Dick. With his new perspective, he could see what the Sea King meant. The pirates weren't just worried about him, their concern was taking on the exact emotional frequency of his own self-doubt. Without meaning to, he was beginning to homogenize their feelings, making them extensions of his own psyche. "How do I stop it?" Joy Boy asked the same question. The Sea King answered. In the end, he chose to scatter his power across the world, hiding it in objects and places and bloodlines, ensuring that no one person could ever again accumulate such dangerous strength. The poneglyphs, the ancient weapons, even the devil fruits themselves, all are fragments of what he once wielded as a unified whole. But the cost of that choice was his life and the lives of everyone who helped him. The Void Century ended not with victory, but with mutual annihilation. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Luffy like the crushing depths of the ocean. He was following in the footsteps of someone who had nearly destroyed the world, and the only way that person had found to stop himself was death. There has to be another way, he insisted, but even as he thought it, he could feel the truth of his situation pressing against his consciousness. Every second he spent in this state, every expansion of his awareness, every unconscious use of his infinite power was taking him further down the same path Joy Boy had walked. Perhaps the Sea King allowed, but it would require a sacrifice of a different kind. You would need to choose limitation over power, humanity over godhood. And that choice becomes harder to make with each passing day as your mortal perspective fades and divine awareness takes hold. As if to emphasize the point, Luffy suddenly became aware of something happening on Fishman Island itself. In the Ryugu Palace, Princess Shirahoshi was crying not from sadness, but from a strange resonance she felt with his presence. Her own power, the ability to command Sea Kings, was responding to his awakened state. But more than that, Luffy could sense the exact nature of her tears, could feel the princess's confusion and fear as if they were his own emotions. Without conscious intent, he began to project comfort toward her, his infinite haki reaching across the distance to soothe her distress. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Shirahoshi's tears stopped, replaced by an unnatural calm that wasn't her own. On Fishman Island, conflicts that had been brewing for years suddenly seemed less important. Old grudges felt pointless. Even the most hardened criminals found themselves questioning the value of violence. Luffy was unconsciously fixing an entire kingdom, imposing his own sense of peace on every living thing within his expanding sphere of influence. "Do you see?" the Sea King asked gently. "This is how it begins. First, you solve one problem, then another. Each use of your power feels justified, necessary, good, but with each intervention, you become less human and more something else." Joy Boy convinced himself he was saving the world right up until the moment he nearly destroyed it. Above them, the crew of the Moby Dick was experiencing their own crisis. They had lost sight of Luffy in the depths, and their attempts to follow him had been blocked by the circle of Sea Kings. Ace was preparing to dive after his brother despite the impossible odds. But it was King Neptune's arrival that changed everything. The massive Merman King approached the Moby Dick in a state of visible panic, his trident glowing with ancient power. "Pirates," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the water. "You must leave this place immediately. The Sea Kings are responding to something catastrophic." "Our friend is down there," Ace shouted back, flames flickering around his body despite the water. "We're not leaving without him." Neptune's expression grew even more grave. "Your friend, he's the one causing this, isn't he? The disturbance we've been sensing for days, the way the sea itself seems to be changing its patterns. What do you know about what's happening to him?" Marco demanded. Neptune was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes reflecting knowledge passed down through generations of Fishman royalty. "There are legends," he said finally, "stories of humans who gained power over the voice of all things itself. The last time it happened, it nearly ended the world." In the depths below, Luffy was receiving the same education from the Sea Kings, but with far more detail and far more personal stakes. He could feel his humanity slipping away like sand through his fingers, could sense his friends becoming more like beloved pets than equal companions in his transformed perception. "What would happen if I just stayed down here?" he asked the ancient Sea King. "If I never went back to the surface?" The ocean would become your domain, came the reply. Every sea creature would become an extension of your will. The tides themselves would bend to your emotions. And eventually, when the loneliness became too much to bear, you would reshape the surface world to provide yourself with companions who could never leave you. Joy Boy tried isolation for a decade. In the end, it only delayed the inevitable. Luffy floated in the crushing depths, surrounded by beings older than civilization, and faced the most important choice of his life. He could return to the surface and try to learn control, knowing that each day brought him closer to becoming something monstrous. He could stay in the depths and try to contain his influence, knowing that isolation would eventually drive him to greater extremes. Or, there is a third option, the Sea King said, reading his thoughts. But it would require a kind of courage that Joy Boy never possessed. What kind of courage? The courage to trust others with your weakness instead of burdening them with your strength. Before Luffy could ask what that meant, he felt a familiar presence approaching from above. Ace had ignored all danger and dived after him, his devil fruit powers creating a barrier of superheated water around his body as he descended toward the crushing depths. The sight of his brother risking death to reach him sparked something in Luffy's chest, not the infinite awareness that had defined him since Marineford, but something smaller and more precious. A purely human emotion that cut through all his cosmic perspective like a blade through silk. Love, simple, uncomplicated mortal love for his sworn brother, that the Sea King observed with something like approval, is what Joy Boy forgot. In trying to save everyone, he stopped valuing anyone. Luffy swam upward to meet Ace, and when their eyes connected through the dark water, he made his choice. He would go back to the surface. He would face the growing monstrosity of his power, but he would not face it alone, and he would not let his love for his friends be consumed by his desire to protect them, even if it killed him, even if it killed them all. Because the alternative, becoming a god who loved no one because he controlled everyone, was a fate worse than any death. The Sea Kings watched as the two brothers swam toward the surface together, and in their ancient minds, they wondered if this time might be different. If this time, love might prove stronger than infinite power. But they had hoped the same thing about Joy Boy, and they remembered how that story had ended. Fishman Island's Ryugu Palace had never hosted a crisis quite like this one. In the Grand Throne Room, King Neptune paced nervously while his daughter Shirahoshi cowered behind her massive frame, tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of something vast and alien pressing against her consciousness. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling, "there's someone like me, but different, stronger. I can feel him in the water, and he's what, dear? He's everywhere." Outside the palace, the Straw Hat Pirates had finally reunited on Fishman Island's surface, but their relief at finding Luffy safe was short-lived. The boy who had emerged from the depths was even more changed than before. His conversations with the Sea Kings had left him with knowledge that sat uneasily in his transformed consciousness, and his crew could sense the difference immediately. "You learned something down there," Robin observed, her archaeologist's instincts picking up on the subtle shift in his demeanor. Luffy nodded slowly, his infinite eyes reflecting the coral lights of the underwater kingdom. "I learned what I'm becoming, and what happened to the last person who became it." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the crisis that had been brewing on Fishman Island finally erupted around them. Hody Jones and his new Fishman pirates burst through the plaza's main entrance, their leaders' steroid-enhanced muscles bulging with artificial strength. "Humans!" Hody roared, his shark teeth gleaming with hatred. "You dare to pollute our sacred kingdom with your presence? Today, you die for the sins of your entire species." It should have been a moment for battle, for the kind of explosive confrontation that defined pirate conflicts. Instead, Luffy simply turned to look at Hody with mild interest, and everything changed. The fishman's charge slowed, then stopped entirely as he found himself caught in the full weight of Luffy's attention. But this wasn't Conqueror's Haki in any traditional sense, it was something far more invasive and terrible. Luffy's observation Haki, expanded to cosmic proportions, was reading every aspect of Hody's being simultaneously. His past, his motivations, his deepest fears and secret shames, all of it was laid bare in an instant. "You're not angry because humans hurt you," Luffy said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that made the water around them ripple. "You're angry because you've never been hurt by humans at all, and that makes your hatred feel empty. You want to suffer so your rage will feel justified." The psychological precision of the observation hit Hody like a physical blow. How could this human stranger see so clearly into the dark corners of his soul? You don't know anything about. Your mother was killed by a human when you were 7, Luffy continued, his tone completely detached. Except that's not true, is it? She died from a disease that could have been cured with surface world medicine, but your father was too proud to seek help from humans. You've been carrying that guilt ever since, turning it into hatred, because hatred is easier than admitting your family's prejudice killed the person you loved most. Hody staggered backward, his enhanced muscles trembling. The accuracy of the assessment was devastating, but worse was the way it was delivered, not with anger or judgment, but with the clinical detachment of a doctor examining a particularly interesting disease. Every fishman you've recruited feels the same way, Luffy went on, his gaze sweeping across the assembled pirates. Inherited rage with no real foundation. Pain you've convinced yourselves you feel because the alternative is admitting that your hatred is a choice. His infinite empathy was a weapon more terrible than any physical attack could have been, and Hody Jones crumpled under its weight, his steroid-enhanced body no defense against having his deepest psychological wounds exposed. But it was what happened next that truly frightened everyone present. Luffy looked around at the assembled fishmen, at their expressions of rage and confusion and dawning self-doubt, and his face filled with something that might once have been compassion but now felt alien and cold. "I can fix this," he said, and the words carried the weight of divine proclamation. "I can make you understand, all of you." His conqueror's Haki began to build, not the crushing wave of willpower they'd experienced before, but something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. Instead of imposing his will on others, he began to share his perspective, flooding their minds with the cosmic awareness that had become his default state. For a brief, terrible moment, every fishman in the plaza experienced existence from Luffy's point of view. They felt the pain of every living thing on the island simultaneously. They sensed the fear and confusion of the human visitors, the ancient sadness of the sea kings in the depths, the weight of 800 years of accumulated prejudice and misunderstanding. They experienced empathy so complete and overwhelming that their individual hatred simply couldn't coexist with it. The transformation was immediate. Weapons clattered to the ground as fishmen who had moments before been ready to commit genocide found themselves weeping for the humans they'd intended to kill. Hody Jones himself fell to his knees, his artificially enhanced body shocking with the magnitude of emotional revelation. I can feel them," one of his subordinates whispered. "The humans, their fear, their confusion, their love for each other. How did I never notice that they love each other the same way we do? It should have been a miracle. Generations of racial hatred dissolving in an instant, replaced by understanding and empathy. The kind of transformation that could change the world for the better." But the Straw Hat Pirates watched in horror because they understood what their captain had just done. He hadn't convinced anyone or changed their minds through argument or inspiration. He had reached into their consciousness and rewritten their fundamental emotional responses. He had turned violent extremists into pacifists not through growth or education, but through direct neural manipulation. "Luffy," Nami said quietly, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name, "what did you just do?" Luffy turned to look at her, and for a moment his expression was puzzled, as if the question hadn't occurred to him. "I fixed them," he said simply. "They were hurting and causing hurt, so I made them understand why that was wrong. Isn't that what we wanted? But you didn't give them a choice," Robin said carefully. "You changed who they were without their consent." "Does it matter?" Luffy asked, and the casual dismissal of such a fundamental ethical concern sent chills through his entire crew. "They're happier now, everyone's safer. The conflict is resolved." He looked around at the transformed fishmen who were now embracing human visitors and apologizing with tears streaming down their faces. "This is objectively better than letting them continue to hurt people out of misguided hatred." The logic was flawless and completely terrifying. "Luffy," Sanji said, his voice strained, "you can't just rewrite people's personalities because you think they'd be better off different." "Why not?" Luffy asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I can see all possible outcomes from any given emotional state. I know exactly what changes would make people happier, safer, more fulfilled. If I have that knowledge and the power to implement it, isn't it cruel to withhold it?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Because he was right in a way that made their moral objections feel petty and short-sighted. That's when the first Transcendence episode hit. It started as a subtle shift in the water around them, currents changing direction, fish altering their swimming patterns, the very ocean beginning to move in response to Luffy's emotional state. But then it escalated rapidly. Luffy's consciousness, already expanded across vast distances, suddenly snapped outward like a rubber band released under tension. His awareness exploded across the entire Grand Line in an instant, connecting with every drop of seawater, every sea creature, every island surrounded by the ocean he was rapidly becoming one with. His physical body went rigid, his eyes rolling back to show only white, while his mouth opened in a silent scream. But the scream wasn't coming from his throat, it was coming from the sea itself, a sound that only creatures sensitive to the voice of all things could hear. On islands thousands of miles away, observation Haki users collapsed, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion of an alien consciousness. Sea kings across the Grand Line began moving toward Fishman Island without understanding why. Weather patterns shifted as Luffy's emotional state began to impose itself on natural systems. And in the plaza beneath the sea, Monkey D. Luffy temporarily ceased to exist as an individual entity. His crew watched in horror as their captain's body became a conduit for something vast and impersonal. When he spoke, it wasn't with his voice, but with the voice of the ocean itself, deep, timeless, and utterly without human warmth. "The child is learning," the voice said, using Luffy's mouth but carrying harmonics that made coral structures crack. "He sees the patterns now, the unnecessary suffering that could be eliminated with proper guidance. He wishes to heal the world." Princess Shirahoshi, her own connection to Sea Kings making her more sensitive than others to what was happening, pressed herself against the palace wall in terror. "That's not him," she whispered. "That's not the person anymore, it's something else wearing his shape." The transformation was spreading. Fish swimming near the plaza began moving in perfect formations. Coral polyps started growing in geometric patterns. Even the artificial sun that lit Fishman Island began to pulse in rhythm with the entity that had once been Luffy. "Pain is inefficient," the voice continued, turning Luffy's body toward his horrified friends. "Conflict is wasteful. With sufficient understanding, all beings can be guided toward optimal emotional states. The child sees this truth." Zoro stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt, but he was facing something that couldn't be cut. "That's not our captain," he said grimly. "I don't know what that is, but it's not Luffy." The entity wearing Luffy's face turned toward him with interest. "The child cares for you, your pain causes him distress. Would you prefer that I adjust your neurochemistry to eliminate the capacity for suffering? It would be a simple matter." The casual offer to lobotomize him was delivered with the same tone one might use to offer directions to a lost tourist. "No," Ace shouted, flames erupting around his body as he faced the thing his brother was becoming. "Luffy, if you're still in there, you need to fight this. This isn't who you are." For a moment, the entity paused, something flickering behind those infinite eyes. "Luffy," it repeated as if testing the name. "Yes, the child calls himself by that designation. He is concerned about your reaction. He does not understand why you appear distressed by the improvement of conditions." "Because we're not conditions," Nami screamed, tears streaming down her face. "We're people, we're your friends, and friends don't fix each other like broken machines." The entity considered this with the detached interest of a scientist examining an unusual specimen. Friendship. An emotional bond that creates mutual obligation and shared suffering. The child values this concept highly, though its inefficiency is obvious. It turned Luffy's head toward the transformed fishmen who were still weeping and embracing in their artificial enlightenment. "Observe how much happier they are without the burden of hatred. Their improved emotional state validates the intervention. But they're not themselves anymore," Robin protested. "You've turned them into something else. They are better versions of themselves," the entity replied with absolute certainty. "All beings are works in progress. The child has merely accelerated their development toward optimal states." The conversation was becoming increasingly surreal as they argued ethics with what was essentially the ocean given consciousness and Luffy's memories. But it was Usopp who finally said what they were all thinking. "You're going to do this to everyone, aren't you?" he whispered. "To the whole world." The entity paused, and for the first time, something like emotion flickered across its borrowed features. "The child sees the suffering of all living things, the wars, the hatred, the unnecessary pain caused by misunderstanding and fear. With his power, all of it could be eliminated. Would that not be the greatest act of love possible?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, and that made it even more terrifying. Because from its perspective, turning the entire world population into perfectly controlled beings was indeed an act of love. It was Chopper who finally broke through to whatever remained of Luffy inside the cosmic entity. The little reindeer stepped forward, tears streaming down his face, and said the one thing that could still reach their captain's humanity. "Luffy, you promised you'd never lie to us. But you're lying to yourself right now." The entity froze, Luffy's body going perfectly still. "You say you want to help people, but you're doing this because it makes you feel better. You can't handle feeling everyone else's pain, so you're trying to eliminate pain entirely. That's not love, Luffy, that's selfishness." For a long moment, silence stretched across the plaza. Then, slowly, Luffy's eyes began to focus again. The infinite depths receded slightly, replaced by something more recognizably human. Chopper, his voice was his own again, confused and frightened. What happened? I was trying to help them, and then I was everywhere. I was everyone. I couldn't tell where I ended and the ocean began. The transformation wasn't complete. His hair remained white, his eyes still held too much knowledge, and his presence continued to affect the environment around them. But for now, Monkey D. Luffy was present in his own body again. "You had a transcendence episode," Marco explained, his medical training helping him stay calm despite what they'd witnessed. "You temporarily lost individual consciousness and became something else, Yoi. Did I hurt anyone?" "You fixed Hody Jones and his crew," Zoro said bluntly. "Rewrote their personalities to eliminate their capacity for hatred." Luffy looked around at the transformed fishmen, who were still embracing humans and weeping with artificial joy, and his face crumpled with an emotion too complex for words. "I did that? You thought you were helping," Nami said gently, though her own voice shook. Luffy stared at his hands as if they were stained with blood. "I can still feel it," he whispered, "the temptation to reach out and fix things. Every person I look at, I can see exactly what changes would make them happier, safer, better, and it would be so easy." He looked up at his crew with desperate eyes. "How do I stop wanting to save everyone?" It was a question none of them could answer, because the desire to help others was so fundamentally part of who Luffy was that removing it might destroy him entirely. But as they stood in the plaza beneath the sea, surrounded by the artificial peace he had imposed on former enemies, they all understood one terrible truth: their captain was losing himself to his own compassion. And they were running out of time to save him from becoming the most benevolent monster the world had ever seen. The island of Punk Hazard appeared on the horizon like a wound in reality itself, half frozen in eternal winter, half burning in perpetual flame. But as the Thousand Sunny approached the scarred landmass, even its dramatic appearance paled in comparison to the readings pouring from Nami's weather instruments. "This is impossible," she muttered, staring at dials that spun wildly without settling on any consistent measurement. "The atmospheric pressure is fluctuating in patterns I've never seen. It's like the island's weather systems are responding to something." Luffy stood at the bow, his white hair flowing in winds that touched no one else. Since Fishman Island, his transcendence episodes had become more frequent, each one lasting longer and taking him further from his human consciousness. Now, even in his lucid moments, the boundary between Monkey D. Luffy and the cosmic force he was becoming felt paper-thin. "The island is in pain," he said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that made the ship's wood creak in sympathy. "Caesar's experiments. They've been using artificial Haki enhancement on test subjects. I can feel their suffering from here." Dr. Law, who had joined them specifically to study Luffy's condition, looked up from his medical readings with grave concern. "How can you possibly sense that from this distance?" "Distance doesn't mean much anymore," Luffy replied, his infinite eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain the entire Grand Line. "I can sense every living thing on that island. The test subjects in the underground labs, the children who have been turned into giants, the ones who didn't survive the experiments." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and for a moment his crew caught a glimpse of the boy he used to be, someone who would have raged at injustice, who would have charged headfirst into battle to save innocent people. Now, he simply stood there, bearing the weight of cosmic awareness with the resigned sadness of someone who could see all suffering, but was losing the ability to respond to it with purely human emotion. "There are Marines there too," he continued. "A research division I don't recognize. They've been trying to replicate what happened to me at Marineford, the artificial awakening experiments. They're not going well." Robin shuddered, her archaeologist's mind immediately grasping the implications. "They're trying to create more people like you, people like me," Luffy repeated softly. But I'm not really people anymore, am I? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Because looking at him now, hair white as seafoam, eyes reflecting impossible depths, presence so overwhelming that seabirds changed their flight patterns to avoid him, it was hard to argue that he was still entirely human. "You're still you," Ace insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Over the past weeks, he'd watched his little brother slip further and further away, becoming something that wore Luffy's face but thought with a cosmic perspective that Ace couldn't begin to comprehend. "Am I?" Luffy asked, turning those infinite eyes toward his sworn brother. "When I look at you now, Ace, I can see your entire genetic history written in your Haki signature. I know exactly what you're going to say before you say it, how you'll react to every possible stimulus. I love you, but it's becoming abstract, like loving a particularly beautiful equation." The casual brutality of the admission hit Ace like a physical blow. This was his little brother, the boy who had sworn to become Pirate King, who had charged into the heart of the world government to save him. But the person speaking now analyzed love like a clinical phenomenon rather than feeling it as a lived experience. "Luffy," Chopper said carefully, "when we get to the island, you need to let us handle the fighting. Every time you use your powers now—" "I know," Luffy interrupted gently. "Every time I actively use my abilities, I slip a little further toward becoming something else. But Chopper, there are children on that island, test subjects. Some of them are dying from the experiments." He looked around at his crew with an expression of infinite sadness. "How do I choose between saving them and staying human?" It was Law who answered, his medical training allowing him to approach the problem with clinical detachment. "We save them together. You guide us to where they are, we handle the rescue." Division of labor. "And if that's not enough?" Luffy asked. "If the only way to save them requires me to use the full extent of my power?" No one had an answer for that because they all knew what Luffy's choice would be. He might be losing his humanity, but at his core, he was still someone who couldn't ignore suffering. As they landed on Punk Hazard's shore, the true scope of the world government's experiments became clear. Hidden beneath Caesar's more obvious laboratory was a massive research facility dedicated to something called Project Titan, an attempt to artificially induce the kind of awakening that had transformed Luffy. The test subjects they found in the underground chambers were barely recognizable as human. Some had been driven insane by forced Haki expansion, their minds shattered by awareness they couldn't process. Others had physically mutated, their devil fruit powers running wild without the consciousness to control them. But worst of all were the ones who had partially succeeded. In the deepest chamber, they found a former Marine Vice Admiral who had volunteered for the experiments. Captain Kobe, older now, his pink hair streaked with premature white, knelt in a specially reinforced cell, his body radiating uncontrolled Haki that had already killed 3 researchers who got too close. "Luffy?" Kobe's voice was strained, his eyes unfocused as he struggled to contain power that was tearing his sanity apart. "Is that really you, or are you another hallucination?" Luffy approached the cell slowly, his infinite awareness immediately cataloging the extent of Kobe's condition. The forced awakening had given him a fraction of Luffy's power, but without the gradual acclimatization, his mind was fracturing under the strain. "I'm real, Kobe," Luffy said softly. "What did they do to you?" They wanted to understand. "How you became what you are," Kobe gasped, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of maintaining coherent thought. "They thought if they could replicate the conditions at Marineford. But they couldn't replicate your emotional state, the love you felt for Ace. They tried to force the awakening through artificial stimulation and," he screamed suddenly, his Haki flaring out in an uncontrolled burst that cracked the reinforced walls. "I can hear everything, Luffy, every Marine on every ship, every thought, every feeling. But I can't turn it off. I can't make it stop." The sight of his old friend, someone who had always represented the best aspects of the Marines, reduced to this broken state filled Luffy with an emotion he hadn't felt since his transformation began. Pure, undiluted rage, but this wasn't the explosive anger of his youth. This was something colder and infinitely more dangerous, the wrath of a being whose power could reshape reality itself. The temperature in the chamber began to drop as Luffy's emotions affected the local environment. Ice crystals formed on the walls despite the facility's heating systems. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of his displeasure. "Who did this?" he asked, and his voice carried harmonics that made the entire facility shake. "Admiral Ryokaju," Kobe managed between waves of psychic agony. "He's been studying your condition since Marineford. He thinks he can create an army of living gods loyal to the world government. That's when Luffy made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his increasingly inhuman existence. He reached out with his infinite haki and gently touched Kobe's mind, not to control or rewrite, but to share the burden. For just a moment, he took on some of Kobe's suffering, using his own expanded consciousness to filter and organize the chaotic input that was driving his friend insane. The relief on Kobe's face was immediate and heartbreaking. "Oh," he breathed, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Oh, that's so much better. Thank you, Luffy, thank you." But the cost of that mercy became apparent immediately. Taking on even a fraction of Kobe's artificial awakening symptoms pushed Luffy closer to his next Transcendence episode. His eyes began to lose focus, his consciousness starting to drift outward toward the cosmic perspective that was becoming his default state. Luffy, Ace grabbed his brother's shoulder, trying to anchor him to the present moment. "Stay with us." "I'm trying," Luffy whispered, but his voice was already beginning to carry those otherworldly harmonics. "But he was in so much pain, Ace. I couldn't just leave him like that." "We'll find another way to help him," Law insisted, but they all knew it was too late. Luffy had made his choice and the consequences were already manifesting. Around them, the facility's electronic systems began to malfunction as Luffy's expanding haki interfered with their operations. Security doors opened and closed randomly. Lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. Even the air filtration systems started operating in rhythm with Luffy's breathing. "The building is responding to him," Robin observed with scientific fascination and growing horror. "He's unconsciously imposing his will on inanimate objects now." That's when Admiral Ryokaju arrived with his research team, drawn by the facility's alarms and the massive haki disturbance Luffy was generating. The Green Bull stepped into the chamber with the confidence of someone who believed he understood what he was dealing with. He was catastrophically wrong. "Monkey D. Luffy," Ryokaju said, his plant-based powers already beginning to sprout vines and roots throughout the chamber. "You're going to come with us? We have questions about your condition that need answers." Luffy turned toward him, and the Admiral immediately understood that he had made a terrible mistake. Looking into those infinite eyes was like staring into the heart of a black hole. There was intelligence there, vast and alien, but it was no longer entirely human. "You hurt my friend," Luffy said, and the simple statement carried the weight of absolute judgment. "You tortured him to try to become like me. Do you understand what I am?" Without waiting for an answer, Luffy reached out with his observation haki and showed him. For one terrible instant, Admiral Ryokaju experienced existence from Luffy's perspective. He felt the suffering of every test subject in the facility, the anguish of families who had lost loved ones to the experiments, the cosmic loneliness of awareness so vast that individual human lives seemed like flickering candles in an infinite void. The Admiral dropped to his knees, his plant powers withering as his mind struggled to process what he'd experienced. What have you become?" "I'm becoming what you wanted to create," Luffy replied with infinite sadness. "A living god. Someone with power enough to reshape reality according to their will. Someone who can solve every problem, prevent every tragedy, eliminate every source of suffering." He looked around at the test subjects, at Kobe still trembling from his artificial awakening, at his own crew watching with expressions of love and terror. Someone who has to choose between staying human and saving everyone they care about. The choice was made in that moment, though Luffy wouldn't realize it until much later. Faced with Kobe's suffering and the Admiral's ambitions, he had used his power not to destroy or control, but to heal and protect. It was exactly the kind of decision that Joy Boy had made 800 years ago. And like Joy Boy, Luffy was discovering that the road to becoming a monster was paved with the best of intentions. And there you have it, Luffy's incredible journey from a boy who just wanted to save his brother to a cosmic entity who had to choose between infinite power and finite humanity. The fact that he ultimately chose to remain human despite having the ability to reshape reality, that's the most Luffy thing ever, choosing freedom and friendship over absolute control. What was your favorite moment in this story? Was it the Transcendence episodes where Luffy temporarily became one with the ocean, the philosophical battles with Doflamingo and the Five Elders, or that final choice to fight as a human rather than a god? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more insane One Piece concepts like this, and let me know what other what-if scenarios you want to see explored. Until next time, keep that pirate spirit alive. Peace out.